Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Causes of the Great Depression, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me take a minute to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Let me see if I can explain that. First of all, we're independent. That means we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we offer at the center is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center, usually for an academic year, to research and write on topics in the humanities, subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978. We've had about 1,300 scholars work here, and about 1,300 books have been published as a result of research done at the Humanities Center. The place may sound like an ivory tower, and from this picture, it looks like an ivory tower, but the founders didn't want it to be an ivory tower. They were particularly concerned with reaching teachers, among a lot of other audiences, and we do that in a variety of ways. We reach teachers in a variety of ways. And you can find out just how we do that by going to americainclass.org. And that will take you to this page, and from here, you will have access to all of our seminars and the online materials we provide for American history and literature teachers. Now, let me tell you that at the end of our program this evening, you can go to the Causes of the Great Depression website, the website from which you entered the classroom tonight and from which you got your readings, and there you will find a recording of the seminar along with the PowerPoint. We urge you to plunder the PowerPoint if you want to use any of the slides in your classes. That's what it's there for, so feel free to make use of it. You will also find an evaluation form on the website. Please fill that out for us and send it to us. And once we receive that, we will send you a letter certifying that you participated in this seminar, and you can present that to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation warrants. Now, let me explain how we'll do the seminar tonight. Colin Gordon, our seminar leader, will be making remarks keyed to a slide presentation. He'll be posing questions, and then we'll be stopping to analyze some text and some images. And we hope that you'll join us through chat. And the way to do that, if you'll put your cursor in the lower right-hand corner of your screen in the box that I have bracketed here, and type your message and hit that send button, your message will appear in the chat box above. I will be reading the chat all night, and I will be bringing it into the conversation at appropriate times. So please feel free to ask questions. Feel free to make comments. These seminars work best when our participants engage in lively discussion through the chat. Now let's get underway. Our goal this evening is to develop an historical explanation for both the onset and the severity of the Great Depression in the United States. Among the many competing explanations, both contemporary and scholarly, we focus on the collapse of demand in the interwar economy and the challenge of restoring that demand in an era of limited federal powers. You had some really interesting questions on the form. We're going to try to answer these tonight. I don't know if we'll get to all of them in the course of the conversation, but we're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. What, if any, government action led to the Great Depression? What private action, both on the part of individuals and businesses, led to the Depression? What is the relationship, if any, between the consumerism of the 1920s and the Great Depression? How much blame should be placed on consumers themselves in terms of installment buying, credit, and stock market speculation? To what extent should buying on margin and overconsumption be factored into the causation of the Great Depression? Were there any warnings to the Great Depression? Was there any warning to the decline of the business cycle? Why was the Great Depression so severe? In what ways was the Great Depression similar to and different from earlier and later depressions and recessions? Why did Hoover feel that his trickle-down economic philosophy would work? Did the tightening of credit in response to the economic collapse worsen the Depression? Did FDR's policies work, or did World War II end the Great Depression? How do FDR's New Deal policies compare with government policies designed to boost the current economy? To what degree does Hoover's austerity response to the Great Depression shed light on current EU austerity programs? What lessons from that time in terms of austerity versus stimulus are translatable to the European Union situation? What material differences exist that might prevent us from making direct connections? And finally, compare the current problems with depressions of European nations and the troubles of the U.S. prior to the Great Depression. Really excellent questions. And to lead us through those questions and others tonight, we're very pleased to have with us Colin Gordon, Professor of History at the University of Iowa. Colin has written widely on 20th century American politics, particularly the New Deal, business and labor. There are some of his publications. We couldn't put them all on that slide, but let me turn the program over to Colin right now, who will make him the presenter. Colin, it is all yours, so tell us, what caused the Great Depression?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Well, it's a complicated question, and it's not one that is fully resolved. I like to start with this slide from 1932, because I think it captures the political and the economic confusion of the time, with, the gentleman in the circle blaming the Depression on everything from the last war to political bumbling to stock speculation to prohibition. I think I like this because it also draws our attention to different kinds of causes and what we mean by causation. I mean, some of these are simply preceding events like the Versailles Treaty or the stock market crash. But some of these are, what I would characterize as broader background conditions, like the state of world trade or overproduction or bad distribution. And some of these, if you look at the ones that are labeled Congress or politics, really point to public policy, either the failures of policy contributing to the crash or contributing to the slow recovery. And I also like this slide as a starting point because I think it reminds us how much was at stake. Because understanding the causes is important because it points you to the solutions. And so your view of the appropriate solution, the appropriate government action, really depends very much on how you answer this question. The final thing I think I would say on this slide is that, as with any historical explanation of a complex event, I don't think the goal is to pick one of these characters and say that's the cause. Often what we're engaged in is weighing the causes which were more important at a particular point in time. So in fact, as I hope will come across through the course of this evening, all of these come into play in one way or another.
Colin, I think this is an excellent slide for our teachers to use because not only does it illustrate the finger pointing, it also illustrates the complexity of the causes here. All of these things contributed, I would assume, and I think if teachers want to suggest to their students that it was not one thing but a confluence of several things, this is a great slide to use.
Yeah, and I've found this works well with students. If you pick one of them and just ask a student to spin it out as an explanation, or lack of confidence, or inflation, or the war, and you're not really pressing the student to give a single overriding explanation, but just to follow the logic of one of these is a way of at least easing into the topic. Now, in my view, the most useful way to approach this, I think, is to shift the emphasis of the question a little. And in such ways, we focus our attention less on the chain of events that led to the crash. I mean, these are important, but to focus more on the background economic and political weaknesses that turned a market crash, a downturn into the business cycle, into a Great Depression. And the way I like to put this is, the real question is, what made the Great Depression great? And that approach, which I want to develop over the course of the next hour or so, is the idea that we zero in on the notion that the Great Depression is at root a crisis of demand, of a lack of demand in the economy. And there's really three parts to that. First of all, I think we need to understand the lack of demand as a background weakness in the economy, the inability of domestic consumption or trade to keep up with production even before 1929. So these are what I would characterize as sort of background weaknesses in the economy. And if we understand those, then we can recognize the crash that occurs in 1929 as really a question of timing and not anything else. And then we have, of course, more familiarly, the crisis of confidence that occurs as the market crashes, and as that is followed by a series of banking panics. And so in this crisis of confidence, of course, as we know from our last recession, businesses are reluctant to invest, consumers are reluctant to spend, people are reluctant to make big economic commitments, and that includes, engaging in demand in the buying and selling of especially durable goods. And then this crisis demand also plays into the political response, because I think one very useful way of reading the New Deal is to read it as a sort of multifaceted effort to restore purchasing power in the economy, both as a means of accomplishing recovery in the short term, and as a means of preventing the economy from relapsing into depression as soon as any of those programs might be abandoned. So we start then, in terms of the primary sources with Hoover's message to Congress, which comes a little over a year after the stock market crash. So Hoover says in part, economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. Economic wounds must be healed by the action of the cells of the economic body, the producers and the consumers themselves. Recovery can be expedited and its effects mitigated by cooperative action. That cooperation requires that every individual should sustain faith and courage, that each should maintain his self-reliance, that each and every one should search for methods of improving his business or service, that the vast majority whose income is unimpaired should not hoard out of fear, but should pursue their normal living and recreations, that each should seek to assist his neighbors who may be less fortunate, that each industry should assist its own employees, that each community and each state should assume its full responsibilities for organization of employment, relief of distress, with that sturdiness and independence which built a great nation. Now, what I like about this excerpt from Hoover's address is how strongly comes across his conviction, as he says at the outset, that economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action, that it must be healed by the actions of the cells of the economic body. And of course, if we read this in retrospect, if we read this from a vantage point of 80, 90 years hence, it seems somewhat cold. Although I think we need to read it as really a sort of perfect representation of the conventional economic wisdom of the day. I'm not even sure in 1930 that Franklin Roosevelt would have said anything substantially different. But as there is a conviction that business cycles correct themselves. And I think the other nice thing, which is very characteristic of Hoover's response to depression, is his propensity to make a list of those who can help. And the list always stops short of the federal government. So it's individuals and businesses and communities and states and nonprofits, but never the federal government. Because Hoover was, as we'll see, very leery of letting that camel's head inside the tent, of setting any precedent for federal responsibility.
Colin, we have a question about Hoover's State of the Union address here. Participant writes, I noticed that in 1932, bank deposits were 105 or 125 or whatever of the 1928 levels. How could this be true with widespread bank failures and the crisis of confidence?
It's a good question, and part of it I think comes from the way in which you're measuring bank assets in the 1930s prior to the onset of any sort of systematic bank regulation. The banking panics didn't necessarily entail a disappearance of deposits, but bank closures and bank panics did restrict access to them. Credit was much more expensive, for example.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Do you have anything? Oh, okay. We have two other questions, Colin, if I could invite them here. Would the typical American of the time have understood Hoover's terms? Was his audience the average American, or was he really talking to someone else?
Yeah, I think both of those things are true. I mean, one can always see in Hoover's speeches, particularly after the crash in 1929, he's pointedly addressing Congress. He's really warning Congress what territory it can and cannot tread on. But he's also, and this was true of Hoover before 1929, very much of a sort of cheerleader for the economy. He's trying to encourage people, trying to sort of snap the country out of that crisis of confidence, with the sense that if everyone feels, that everyone else is going to pitch in, spend a little bit of money, hire one more person, that in fact we could climb out of that. And we'll see that in a couple of the illustrations that are coming up.
I have another question here that pretty much addresses one of the forum questions. In the forum, people ask if there are any warning signs, and here tonight in the chat, were there indications at that time that this depression would be so much worse than the previous ones, especially the 1893 depression? So were there any warning signs, and was there anything to suggest that this was a depression different from ones we'd experienced before?
That's a very good question, and it's a hard one to answer, because I think it is true that economists, and we'll see a couple of examples of that coming up, economists generally did understand that the economy had changed, that it was in a sense much more vulnerable to a collapse of demand, because the economy had became much more oriented around consumer goods in the course of the decade after World War I. So it moved, economic growth in the 19th and early 20th century was very much centered around producer goods, around steel for railroads and building basic infrastructure. That shifts with electrification and the automobile revolution and the emergence of a much more expansive market in consumer goods and consumer durables, things like automobiles and appliances in the 1920s. So, in that sense, people understood that it was a different kind of economy. But it doesn't necessarily translate into the way in which people responded, because I think Hoover's response is very typical. They thought the cycle would act like any other business cycle, that it would bottom out, things would get cheap, and it would sort of self-correct. And wages would fall, and that would allow employers to hire more people, and the sort of natural supply and demand curves would take over. And I think most were surprised and distressed that that's not what happened.
So that addresses another one of our forum questions, the fact that indeed consumer buying and installment credit and all that sort of thing did have a role to play in the coming of the Great Depression.
Yes, and again, this is pushes us ahead a bit. I have a nice slide later on that shows the gap between what people were able to afford on their wages and in order to maintain a standard of living through the 1920s. So it's popularly known as the Roaring '20s, but it didn't roar for everybody, and much of the prosperity was leveraged through installment buying, and even much of the stock buying was leveraged through margin buying and selling. And in that sense, to address another one of the sort of common themes in the forum, there are really some striking parallels to our most recent recession. because in a sense the form of household debt shifts. It was all in housing in 2007, and it was in consumer goods and installment buying in 1927, and the form of financial speculation shifts from sort of margin stock buying to the credit derivatives that we saw in 2007, 2008. But the ways in which those elements contributed to the collapse of the economy are in a sense very similar.
Okay, good. Well, shall we move ahead then?
Sure. So one nice way to follow up on Hoover's speech, I think, is to go to these two editorial comments on Hoover. The first of these cartoons shows Hoover sort of standing guard over a dike, which is labeled with things like the protective tariff and sound money, preservation of liberty, individual responsibility. And one can read the waves as the sort of tumult of popular demands in Congress, whereas Hoover is the sort of steadying hand. The second cartoon has him rebuffing what are labeled politically expedient demands on the federal treasury. If you can see, the roll of paper in his hand is labeled bonus stand, and that refers to Hoover's refusal to pay a bonus to veterans of World War I that the bonus army movement had demanded. This was seen as a sort of stimulus package at the time. For the veterans had been promised a bonus in 1945, and the bonus army movement requested that bonus be paid early because most of them were out of work. I think what's interesting about both of these cartoons is not just that they do a nice job of capturing Hoover's rugged individualism, his guarding of small government and the U.S. Treasury, but that they're both admiring. I mean, the second one is labeled "well done." So the news, at least these two examples of editorial comment, generally admired Hoover for not caving into political pressure.
Let me ask you to speculate, Colin. If Hoover had moved early, if he had done something in 30 and 31, would the Great Depression have been as severe? Could he have, as Barney Fife might say, nipped it in the bud?
I don't think so. There is a school of thought, what's called the sort of monetary account of the Great Depression, which holds that if the Federal Reserve had stepped in immediately, loosened the money supply, made sure that credit was adequate, they'd done what in retrospect would have been some fairly small things, that they could have dramatically slowed the slide into depression and brought about recovery much more quickly. That's not a view that I think most economic historians agree wholeheartedly with. I think it's animated by a sort of retrospective belief that the New Deal went too far, that it didn't need to establish this elaborate set of programs as it did, and so as I noted at the outset, there's a lot at stake in sorting out these causes, because if you can imagine a simple way for the market to rebound, what it means is you're also imagining a world in which a larger federal presence is not necessary.
Right, and here we have another question. Did not Hoover act in an unprecedented way? In other words, in previous recessions, did the government step in?
Is the question whether Hoover's lack of action was unprecedented?
Yes, I think it's got a double negative in here, and that always twists your mind. I think that's what we're at.
Because the answer to the question, and I think actually it's a very important one, is that in retrospect, when we look at what Hoover did in 1929, 30, and 31, he actually did far more than might have been expected of someone who held to a sort of rugged individualist views. He established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He did a great deal with regard to banking regulation. He did launch a number of spending programs, although what's interesting is he tried to disguise them. Hoover, in a sense, was willing to take the federal government places where it hadn't been before, but he often wanted to have the money go from the federal government to states or from the federal government to nonprofits, so that he wasn't setting that precedent for new federal responsibility. I mean, I think one way of looking at it is to say that because no one knew the Depression was going to last that long, that Hoover set the country, in a sense, on the course to the New Deal. And I see Mary's question captures this. He does set the pattern. And as a sort of, counterfactual exercise, I think if Roosevelt had been in power in 1928 or 1929, I think you may have seen him stumbling through all of Hoover's steps and not taking dramatic action as he did in 33, 34, 35 until the Depression was 3 or 4 years old.
So people had to realize the severity of the recession to realize that the old ways of doing things just weren't going to work anymore.
Yes, and one good illustration of that is the fact that when Roosevelt comes into office, Roosevelt doesn't make a lot of promises on the campaign trail in 1932. He doesn't need to. Hoover's going to lose the election, as any incumbent president under those economic conditions will. So Roosevelt is vague about his plans, and when he does take office, his first action is to put the brakes on spending. He strives for a balanced budget. So it's in a sense not until he's tried what Hoover tried does he come around to a different set of policies.
That goes back. Would that go back to another one of our forum questions? Did the tightening of credit in response to the economic collapse worsen the Great Depression? Did FDR tighten credit when he came into office initially?
No, I think the question is more in reference to the action of the Federal Reserve, which tightened credit in 1927, 1928 because they were starting to become alarmed by the degree of speculation on the stock market. And interest rates were so low that one could borrow at very low interest rates, buy stocks on margin, play in the exploding market, and in a very over-leveraged fashion, contribute to that sort of speculative mania. What followed from the crash was not so much a further tightening of credit, but the Fed's failure to open the doors a little bit, to make credit more readily available, to step in and sort of act as the lender of last resort to banks that were panicking.
Okay, we've got about an hour left.
Okay, so why don't we move on to this slide. And Richard, can I ask you to read this while I get a drink of water?
Sure, certainly.
Thanks.
We are told that such cycles have always been with booms and depressions alternating, and that they therefore will always will be, and that we are not to become either excited or despairful. Despairful? Well, there will be casualties, many will go hungry, but these are merely the normal incidents of every recorded depression. Wait, never fear. The bottommost point is always certain to be reached in due course, after which those who have survived will begin to work their way upward once more. And someday all will be well again, until the next cyclical period for idleness and suffering shall arrive. A charming doctrine of periodic damnation for all but those most securely entrenched, a doctrine, incidentally, that is most solemnly affirmed by the well-entrenched, who are among our leaders. We must credit them with good minds, good faith, good intent, and they base their belief upon the record of the past. But when God gave out his great gifts of hope and imagination, he seems to have passed them by.
I like this passage from Henry Tynan's article. Tynan is a businessman writing in 1932. And what he's really doing here is satirizing the view that conventional view, the view held by Hoover, perhaps even more famously by Hoover's Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who famously said in response to the Depression that, you know, it was probably a good thing, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate housing, you know, let everything fall through the bottom and then pick up the pieces. You know, and it was callously worded, but Mellon's view was that this is what business cycles do, and when everything gets cheap, we'll pick up the pieces and move on. But Tynan has clearly grown weary of this view. The idea, as he says, that this sort of charming doctrine of periodic damnation, that we always have to live through this. And of course, it's understandable that he would write this in 1932 because it's now, the Depression is now 3 years old. And the notion that the business cycle is going to correct itself is wearing pretty thin for Tynan and for others. And he's clearly, you know, looking to Hoover and looking to Mellon when he concludes that the well-entrenched, and that's probably really a pointed attack on Mellon, are stuck in the past, and they lack, as he says, the hope and imagination to do anything about the Depression. Now, what's not captured in this selection from Tynan's piece is that the broader proposal, Tynan's broader proposal, was what he called, although it was somewhat vaguely worded, steady pay. And he anticipated, in this sense, some of the programs of the New Deal. The idea that if there were mechanisms by which you ensured that people got paid or got help between paychecks, that you could sustain that basic level of consumption. And I think one way to sort of illustrate what Tynan was really poking fun at is to look at the campaigns run in 1931 and 1932 by a sort of quasi-private organization that Hoover helped organize, which was the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief. So this was not a federal agency or a federal effort. It was led by two business leaders whose signatures are on one of these ads, Walter Gifford of AT&T and Owen Young of General Electric. And the principal contribution of the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief was to place magazine ads saying, if you're still working, buy a car, then someone else can work. This idea that you just needed a spark to get everything going again, or you just needed not even just a spark, but everyone just had the confidence that they spent money and their neighbors spent money, that the money that each of you spent would employ the other. And again, it very much captured this sense of sort of rugged individualism. And here we have blown up the text from the preceding slide. And you can see, very much like Hoover's 1930 address, it's an appeal for everyone but the federal government to do something. John K. American, you and you, honest, hardworking folk. We dug the Panama Canal. We put an army in France. And again, a reminder, as he says towards the end here, there is no national agency through which you may contribute. The way for you to give is through your local welfare and relief agencies, community chest, emergency unemployment committee. This, Hoover and others felt, was the American way, and it was also the sort of last ditch effort to prevent a sort of run on the federal treasury. And I think you know, a lot of my colleagues, this came to their mind in 2001, when our next to last recession, when the economy went into a tailspin in 2001. You might remember that one of President Bush's responses at the time was in an address was just to encourage people to get out there and spend some money, and that would help. And in fact, that's the way some of those temporary tax reliefs in 2001, 2002 were structured. That if everyone gets a check for $600, the understanding is everyone will spend it, and that will be sufficient stimulus.
Did Roosevelt echo this a little bit with that we have nothing to fear but fear itself? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I I don't think there's anything in this that Roosevelt would disagree with. And there's nothing in this, except the caution about no national agency. There's nothing down the road that's really incompatible with federal programs, welfare programs, social programs, make work programs running alongside this. Roosevelt, and you're right, the sort of famous nothing to fear but fear yourself fireside chat is perhaps the best example, was also prone to just trying to instill confidence in people out of a feeling that, what had fallen out of the bottom of the economy was not real value, but just people's willingness to buy and sell.
A point of clarification here. One of our participants writes, stimulating the, let me see, it just escaped my view here. Let me get it back. Here we go. Stimulating the economy was the responsibility of the well-endowed patriotic citizen. Wasn't that the message? So that's basically what these ads and Hoover are saying, right?
I would say more broadly. I mean, if we, he's not, in this one, for example, really aimed at the well-endowed. He's looking to ordinary Americans. And I think, if you look more broadly at the efforts of this organization, the real target was anybody who was working. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't necessarily the well-heeled, but anybody who had a job, was had money in their pocket that could be helping somebody else have a job. He didn't want anybody sitting on their money.
Okay, and we have an interesting point here. A participant raises an interesting point. Get it back here. Isn't that part of the problem? Take the money and spend it. How about saving money? Would saving money at this time have had a good effect? I mean, we just got through talking about how consumerism helped to lead to the Great Depression. Wouldn't saving money get us out of the hole?
No. I mean, generally, economists, the view is that nobody should be sitting on their money, not the Federal Reserve, not the federal government, not individuals. That if you don't get out and spend it, if it's not circulating in the economy, it's not going to contribute to recovery. Mm-hmm. So what may make sense from the perspective of an individual or from a family, which is to save against hard times, may actually contribute to the larger problem.
To the larger problem. We have a question about the dissemination of these ads. The chat is coming in quickly here. Were ads like this widely published? It seems like a literary magazine aims at a fairly narrow band of readers. So how widely published were the ads like these?
Oh, these were very widely published, and despite its name, Literary Digest was a pretty wide circulation magazine in the 1920s and 1930s. And the second one, which I'm not sure where I pulled this one from, but you would see these in all kinds of popular magazines. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And we here have another question about socialism. Was socialism a fear for Hoover? Was it a realistic fear at this time in our country's history, in the early 30s?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say that it was more of a fear for Roosevelt, because radical organizing in response to the Depression is occurring alongside all of this. And there are marches of the unemployed. There are glimmers of what will become the reemergence of a trade union movement. There are socialists elected in local offices, and really strong roots of radicalism in some local settings, some states in particular, in some cities. And that's growing through the course of the early years of the recession, or of the Depression rather. So it's more of a problem when Roosevelt comes to office and the Depression is 3 years old than it is faced by Hoover.
Well, shall we move on then?
Sure. So if Hoover and others are insisted are insisting on seeing the Depression in very conventional terms as a business cycle that will correct itself. Others, I think, begin to recognize that the circumstances are very different. One of those is the retailer Edward Filene, whose family started the Filene department stores in the Boston area. And he was one of the many who began to focus on the sort of larger background problem of insufficient demand in a growing economy. And so writing in early 1929, before the crash, Filene notes, the United States has a greater domestic market than any other nation, a population of 120 million consumers who are more prosperous than any people has been in the history of the world. And yet, this great market, even this great market, could not absorb all the goods that we're able to produce. The surpluses created by operating our plants at capacity must be sold in foreign markets. If they're not, we have a period of super competition in the domestic market, which destroys profits, reduces wages, and creates widespread unemployment, with grave social and political evils as a consequence. Europe is experiencing those evils today. We will experience them tomorrow unless the world is organized for efficient production and orderly trade. Filene's conclusion, which was one that a number of people were coming around to, particularly in the late 1920s, was that the domestic market, or the domestic production, had outgrown the domestic market. It had reached a point where you needed a much more open and orderly and stable international trade system for the United States, which was the world leader in most of these areas of production, to be able to continue to grow. So that trade and some sort of guarantee, some sort of mechanism for ensuring that it stays open is really the only solution. And we see that in this editorial comment from 1930, from just after the crash, characterizing the American position vis-a-vis Latin America, in which the trade barriers running down the middle of the cartoon not only are preventing the U.S. from selling manufactured goods to an emerging area of the world, but the United States is also losing access to key commodities and raw materials that would allow it to grow, create more manufactured goods, and sell them to more areas of the world. And so this was, I think, widely appreciated, particularly in 1929, 1930, and 1931. And in some respects, it's really a legacy, as if we think back to that original slide, of the war and of the Versailles Peace Treaty, of the failure of the United States and others, but the United States and Woodrow Wilson were the leading voices. The failure to emerge from the war with any international commitment to open trade. And so, in fact, trade retreats in the 1920s, and I'll have a graphic in a moment that nicely illustrates that. So that again, you have that background weakness of insufficient demand because the trading markets aren't open, and that background weakness makes the United States, as the leading producer, extraordinarily vulnerable to any sort of shock in demand, particularly if you consider the fact, and this is exactly what happens, that if a number of countries go into depression at the same time, they'll all throw up tariff barriers and things will get worse very quickly. So in fact, the mechanism works in exactly the wrong direction. Rather than opening demand in response to an economic crisis, everyone's sort of selfish beggar thy neighbor view is to protect their own market to the detriment of all.
Right. We have a comment in the chat about that. The Treaty of Versailles, the very thing you mentioned, meant that the world could not turn to colonization to soak up overproduction as happened in the later 19th century. Now, you're talking about trade barriers. What about colonization? I mean, if you have a colony, presumably you don't have a trade barrier. So, did colonization stop at this period? How did colonization figure in, if it did at all, to the causes of the Great Depression?
That's a very good point. And in that respect, the cartoon on the screen now is a little bit misleading in the sense that, the United States wanted the raw commodities from Latin America. But Latin America was not yet an important market for the manufactured goods. The United States was helping build infrastructure, was sending railroad stock and other things to Latin America. But the market for manufactured goods are the other industrialized countries for the most part, Western Europe and the like. So most of the countries, the United States included, have formal or informal colonial networks that give them some access to these raw commodities. But what they don't have is stable access to trade the manufactured goods. The one exception, which is a different kind of colonial network, is the British, who maintained the Sterling Bloc, which was not only a sort of colonial network, but also included Canada and Australia, other possessions of the British Empire, as a sort of closed trading system. And here again, the United States has, in a sense, much more at stake than other countries, because, as Filene argues, it needs that trade in order for its economy to grow. It's the one that will lose most if trade is shut off.
We have a number of questions about the demeanor of Uncle Sam. Some people think he looks content, others impatient. And one person asked, is he holding something? Is he holding a life preserver or something? We're just curious about the image. Any help on that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could read his posture and his demeanor either way. I mean, it is important, and I see, somebody noted this in the comments, that while the United States, while the objective position of the United States was that they would thrive under free trade, they were playing the game with everybody else, and they, in fact, in some respects, sparked the tariff war post-1929 with the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930.
Right, yeah.
Because when trade policy went to Congress, of course, from the perspective of any individual member of Congress, they're going to stand up and say, well, I'm going to protect the steel industry, or I'm going to protect the shoe industry, or I'm going to protect the textile industry. And the net result, everybody gets protected. But everybody gets protected in other countries as well, which has the effect of strangling trade. So the real problem is the absence of any sort of international body, international mechanism for negotiating trade agreements means that everyone will act selfishly, and the end result is what no one wants.
Right, and we have an interesting question here, or an interesting comment. Let me get it back up here. Participant writes, you would think other countries would want all of those new inventions in their homes too. And presumably she's talking about all the household goods that the 1920s brought us. But was that possible? I mean, Europe was Europe electrified? Was it ready for all of those household inventions? Probably Latin America wasn't. So to what extent could we export all of those electronic wonders that were developed in the 1920s?
To Canada, which was part of the British Sterling Bloc, which the U.S. saw as an important outlet, but one that was largely closed, especially in 1930. Western Europe certainly was a market. It was a little bit behind the United States in terms of, in some respects. But, you have to remember that Western European countries are much more compact, much more urbanized than the United States. And so their basic infrastructure were things like electricity and that sort of thing. We're proceeding apace with the United States. And with regard to the less developed country, the view of producers in the United States was that, yeah, those countries weren't there yet in terms of buying a lot of automobiles and washing machines, but they were getting there. And the goal was, of course, to get them there as quickly as possible. And there's a whole stage of trade that sort of precedes the consumer goods trade, where you're trading in basic infrastructure. You're trying to develop railroads and telephones and that sort of thing. So, the companies that were the American companies that were deeply involved in Latin America in the early years of the 20th century were not only the commodity companies like United Fruit, but they were also railroads, American Telegraph, Telephone and Telegraph, ITT, that were building basic infrastructure and trying to move those countries along in their development so that they could become more reliable consumers.
I see. Yeah, good point. We have a question here about tariff revisions. Were the tariff revisions of 1929-30 initiated as free trade efforts, but after amendments ended up strongly protectionist?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. I mean, certainly the administration's plan The administration's view was that we needed revision, and we needed revision downward. But the administration couldn't control the bill once it was on the floor of Congress. And that's when the logic I outlined a moment ago sort of took over. And you know, there was no mechanism from the federal level by which they could say, no one can raise, you know, we're not going to raise tariffs on these goods, or there's going to be a cap on a certain level of tariff. In fact, it was very much a sort of free-for-all, both within Congress and within the larger trading world as well.
Okay. We have an interesting comment here about electrification in the 1930s. There were large areas within the United States that were still not electrified by 1930. Could the rural electrification program of the 30s, could that be seen as a stimulus program?
Oh yeah, and you know, so once we get to those sorts of programs under the New Deal, they were very much all of the infrastructure programs, the building of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought hydropower to a large chunk of the South. The rural electrification, which is seen, you know, it's not only a form of immediate stimulus, you know, a sort of shovel-ready stimulus project, but it also contributes to future consumption, because then it allows those people to buy electric goods down the road.
Right. So, as one of our participants writes, TVA was considered a stimulus program.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then, Colin?
Sure. And so I followed this with you know, another businessman writing in 1931, and it's, you could read this as basically a confirmation of Filene's assessment of what would happen, of how vulnerable the U.S. is to a trading panic. So Fahey writes, it's unnecessary to go into detail illustrative of the losses which we've incurred as a result of the tariff changes. And here he's referring to Smoot-Hawley and the tariff war that follows. It is said in partial apology for the policy we have followed that after all, during this worldwide depression, our losses have not been proportionally more than those of other countries. But can we find any great encouragement in that fact? Is it a real consolation to know that if we have lost, others have likewise lost in equal proportion? What are we going to do about it all? Well, it's not so difficult to get down tariffs to get tariffs up under some circumstances, but it's much more difficult to get them down. And if we agree that some worldwide policy of gradual tariff reductions is not only desirable but necessary, then certainly we must at the same time realize that it's far from being an easily achieved objective. If business is soon to resume its healthy upward development, we must attack this problem. And a real beginning must be made towards the gradual reduction of tariffs. As the nation, which under normal circumstances has the largest export business of any in the world, we bear a peculiar responsibility to contribute at least our share, and indeed a little more than our share, in the leadership of the general movement for a better international adjustment of this annoying and disturbing tariff problem. And here again, I think what Fahey is capturing is the problem is not just the fact that tariffs have gone up, but the problem is the way in which they went up, the fact that there's no way of stepping in and stopping this destructive competition. And, you know, he captures the way in which the United States has so much at stake. It has so much to lose if tariffs are high. It has so much to gain if tariffs are low. And if we move across, we can see what actually happens in terms of trade across this period. And they actually changed the time scale of this graph. So it's not 1909 to 29, but it takes us through to 1939. And you can see leading up to World War I, a clear upward trajectory in particularly American exports, and a very healthy trade balance by the outbreak of the war. Now, the war has a dramatic impact on trade. It strangles it in many respects. And here we see the world of sort of post-war tariffs, with U.S. exports, the green, sort of collapsing to sort of half of what they were at their peak at the end of the war, and climbing very slowly through what an otherwise booming decade. And then, of course, we reach the moment of Smoot-Hawley, when the U.S. is trying to protect its producers by cutting off imports from others. But of course, this is, as all recognized at the time, so cutting off your nose to spite your face, because as it protects its producers from imports, it's also making it impossible for them to export. And you see this dramatic collapse of trade down to the depths of the Depression. With a little bit of progress with the efforts of Fahey and others, in particular Secretary of State Cordell Hull after 1935, but you don't see the real progress in this respect until after World War II, because it's the war that becomes the opportunity for the Americans to sort of sit down with their allies and say, yeah, we'll help defeat these guys, but here's the price. And the price is what becomes the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, all of the institutions that would maintain that sort of healthy trade.
Colin, we've got a few questions here. First of all, could you please define trade balance?
Sure. It's trade balance is just the difference between exports and imports. So if we see the peak of the red line, for example, that represents the difference between the green bar and the blue bar in 1920. Mm-hmm. And so the trade balance is, generally speaking, you want to be exporting more than you import in terms of value, dollar value.
Okay. And here we have another question about tariffs. If the tariffs were not in place, do you think that there might have been enough access to demand where it existed to make a huge difference? While there was no single cause of the Depression, could avoidance of tariff barriers have made a seriously material difference in depth and length? So how important were these tariff wars to the creation of the Depression and its continuation?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's still a stimulus problem in the United States and elsewhere. That is, the tariffs themselves are not constraining demand. At least in the sort of first instance. There's one can imagine taking off all the tariffs and saying there are no barriers to trade. You still have a range of industrialized democracies that are all suffering through depressions of their own. Now, it is generally the view of free trade theorists that everyone is better off under conditions of free trade, and that you do generate growth in all of the countries because they trade in goods that they're good at producing, or they export goods that they're good at producing, and they import the ones that they're not that efficient at producing. So I think over time, in the absence of trade barriers, yes, you would have seen some progress to recovery, and you may also have stemmed some of the collapse into 1931 and 1932 as things continued to get worse, if in fact trade was more of an option.
Okay, we've got about a half an hour.
Okay, so now if we go back to our larger organizing idea that this is a crisis of demand, and part of that, as we've traced over the last couple of slides, is the way in which demand from the rest of the world disappears. The flip side of that is the way in which demand at home disappears, and that's, I think, captured in these next couple of selections. So writing in 1933, the economist Irving Fisher notes, the profits of manufacturers have risen sky high. Each working man has been producing much more. The value of goods put out by American factories has greatly increased. And here he's characterizing the 1920s. But the working men are receiving wages in a much smaller share of that value. Now, I dismiss for the moment the unethical procedure whereby labor, and that means the man at the lathe as well as his white-collared colleague at the desk, is paid less for creating more. The chief point is this: the total value of products is greater, the total national wage bill is smaller. How then can the wage and salary earners of the country buy back what they produce? They can't. The concentration of America's wealth and America's national income in fewer and fewer hands has gone on apace for many years. So despite the wide diffusion of stock ownership, profits were remaining with a decreasing percentage of the population, which was too small to consume those profits. Rockefeller, Ford, and Schwab and their brother multimillionaires cannot eat 20 beefsteaks a day, or ride in 50 Packards, or inhabit 70 villas each. There's a natural limit to individual consumption. In other words, the people who want to consume all did not have the means, and the people who had the means could not consume all. This is, I think, a wonderful evocation of that basic dilemma of the 1920s, where the ability to consume at home, where productivity at home is outpacing consumption, and the only way in which consumers, as workers, as consumers, can keep pace with the expectations is by going into debt. And this leaves the economy vulnerable when you get the kind of shock that you get with the market crash of 1929. It's, especially effective here in Fisher's formulation is that line about Rockefeller and Ford not being able to eat 20 steaks a day. What he's really saying, and this again has very stark parallels with our own time, what he's really saying is that an economy can tumble into recession if inequality is too severe, particularly an economy that's organized around broad consumption. And you can see that in the gap, and we referred to this a little bit earlier. So this is what we call an index graph. So rather than mark actual values, we've just pegged both of these, that is the size of the economy and the average earnings of a manufacturing worker, to 100. So they both started 100 in 1914, and we're just seeing how much they increase over time. And so what we see is, through the years leading up until the First World War, the economy grows and wages in the economy grow at the same pace. And they fall at the same pace during the mild post-war recession in 1920-21. But what interests us is this growing gap between the productivity of the economy, which is now 300% of what it was in 1914, 3 times as big, quite literally, and the much slower growth of wages. And this is the gap that Fisher is referring to, that if you want an economy based on broad consumption, you need to drag this line up here. You need to have wages, the wages of average earners, proceed at the same rate as production. So not only is, of course, this gap troubling, but so is what happens after 1929. And so here, in an economy which is much, much bigger, you have a level of consumption that is only marginally bigger than it was 20 years earlier.
We have a question here about the ads that we saw earlier. Were the people who placed these ads aware of this dichotomy between productivity and earnings? I mean, the ads here are encouraging people to spend money, but that was the problem, wasn't it? They didn't have the money to spend.
They were aware. Both Gifford of AT&T and Owen Young of General Electric were widely recognized as progressive employers, as employers who understood this dilemma and strived to pay their workers accordingly. The classic example of this, which dates back to 1914, is Henry Ford's sort of brief initiative of the $5 a day, which was a generous wage at the time. And Ford introduces that in 1914 with much fanfare, explicitly making the argument that he wants his workers to be able to afford his cars. So a lot of individual employers understood the dilemma. The problem was that there were a lot of marginal employers, there were a lot of low-wage employers, and there was no way in which the responsible employers could bring up the rest of them. And so while individual employers might have understood the problem with respect to their own firms and their own workers, they couldn't do anything about it with regard to the economy as a whole.
See, and we have another question here. What would be the effects of bringing wages more in line with productivity? That would help produce that broad-based demand that you were talking about, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. And to give you an example of that from a more contemporary policy debate, there's much discussion about what the value of the minimum wage should be with the introduction, with Obama's call for $9 and Senator Harkin's call for something over $10. If the minimum wage had kept pace with the growth of the economy since the 1960s, it would be about $18 an hour today. So that would be the kind of implication of bringing up the low end of wages at the same pace as economic growth. Because one way to read this gap is to say that if productivity is pulling away from wage growth, then someone else is benefiting. That what this gap means is a growth in inequality. And that's the dilemma that Fisher points out. If you have growing inequality, you have people who are very rich who are not going to go out and buy 20 cars each in order to keep the economy humming.
Right, and we're seeing a similar gap between wage growth and productivity today, right?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, since the 1970s, and so over the last 30 years, productivity, economic productivity, the size of our economy has grown about 80%. Median wages have grown about 5%. So very similar to this kind of trajectory. And contributing, I think, in similar ways to our current recession. And, you know, just to finish that point, we can move on here and actually see that inequality line. So the red line here, which is geared to these percentages, no, it's geared to these the percentages on this axis, is the share of national income that's going to the richest 10%. And as you can see, that's growing through the 1920s. So it grows, I mean, not dramatically, but from under 40% to well over 40% through the 1920s, and then begins to fall off during the 1930s. And what's growing at the same time, which are the bars here, keyed to this axis, is consumer debt as a share of gross domestic product. So those at the bottom who are not getting their share of the income are maintaining a standard of living by borrowing. And both of these, the fact that you have income squirreling away at the top and the fact that you have individuals of ordinary means able to sustain themselves only by borrowing, make the economy very vulnerable.
Right, and you just answered one of the questions that arose here in the forum. People really seem to be charting us quite nicely here. Let me get that question back. What happened to the excess GDP in the 20s? Did people borrow that much to consume it? And the answer is yes, right?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Okay, and we have a participant here trying to sum things up for us here. Wages remain virtually stagnant from 1922 to 29, while output is still growing, but not as quickly. Add to this that European demand for U.S. goods was also in decline during the same time, and that leads to a surplus of goods that manufacturers would need to reduce prices and cut back on production, I can read, and finally lay off workers. Correct? So has this participant captured the spiral that's going on here?
Yes, yes, and I mean, you know, we can leave open the question of how much of this was driven by the background inequality and the slow wage growth, how much of it was driven by the tariff. The share between the two is less important, I think, than appreciating the way in which they combine to create this vulnerability, this collapse of demand. And where that leads us, I think, is to the solutions. And this comes back to my idea of reading the New Deal, reading the solutions that are pressed by the Roosevelt administration after 1933 as, in many respects, just a way of addressing that background problem. How do we restore purchasing power in the economy? Both to win recovery in a sort of stimulus sense, but also to provide a safety net or a floor for that economy so a depression of the severity would not reoccur. Now, part of that answer is trade, But as I suggested earlier, substantial progress is not made here really until World War II, when the U.S. is able to sort of leverage its wartime alliances towards a more open trading system in the post-war period. So in the shorter term, I think the New Deal focused on policies that would sustain and secure the incomes of ordinary Americans. And one example of that I like is this call by leading retailers. This is the contribution of an important business group to the debate over Social Security prior to its passage in 1935. They write, "The United States has sufficient resources, productive capacity, human energy, and skill to provide at least a fair minimum standard of living continuously for all the people. The relations of the United States with the rest of the world are tranquil. It's not torn by internal political or class strife. There's no natural basis for the present disorganized state of economic affairs. All the conditions exist for renewed prosperity and progress. All production and consequent employment is in response to current or expected consumer demand. Effective demand can only occur when the consumer has money or credit. But only through production and distribution can the money or credit which is necessary to create demand become available. Distortion in those relations causes the vicious circle of expansion and depression. Our objective should be to give the worker work, and through adequate reserves and insurance, protection against the hazards of unemployment, old age, sickness, disability, and dependency." Now, unfortunately, the building up of reserves for each of these purposes reduces purchasing power, particularly in the initial stages. But this should not cause us to delay the development of programs, nor should it prevent us from taking the initial steps and progressively increasing a general program of economic security. And what they're talking, of course, here is about what would become Social Security. And Social Security, when it passes in 1935, is not just what we think of today, which is usually just the old age insurance program, but it's separate titles that deal with aid to families with dependent children, what we used to call welfare, old age insurance, a cooperative plan of unemployment insurance with the states, and then discrete programs for public health and aid to the disabled and the blind. So it's taking aim at all of these issues. Where do they list them? The hazards of employment, old age, sickness, disability, and dependency. And the idea in the retailer's argument is that this is a way to put a floor under demand. And eventually we would add to this list the passage of the minimum wage, which comes in 1938.
We had a question earlier about unemployment insurance. Would that also be part of this package?
Yes, unemployment insurance is passed as part of the Social Security Act in 1935. It's one of the key titles.
Okay.
And the one other piece, which also fits into this larger puzzle, of course, is the New Deal's strong defense in 1935 of collective bargaining rights for workers. And there again, they explicitly make the argument that one of the best ways to bring up wages, especially in a world where federal powers are circumscribed by the Constitution, is to give those workers the power to bargain their own wages up. And if, in fact, unions can bring up the wage floor, they'll drive out the low-wage competitors, and they'll restore a much healthier level of consumption to the economy. And here are a couple of illustrations of how that worked over time, that sort of basic New Deal solution, what economists would begin to characterize as demand-side solutions to a recession. And one of these is the trajectory of poverty among seniors and Social Security. So the red line here, keyed to this axis, is the percentage of senior citizens who are in poverty, which in 1937 is almost all of them. You know, it's almost 80% of seniors are in poverty prior to the institution of the Social Security system. Now, it takes some time for the system to come online. People start making contributions. They don't start drawing them until they've sort of built up reserves. And it's in the post-war period here that we see the blue line, per person Social Security spending begin to rise. And as it rises, poverty collapses. And so now, and indeed since the 1970s, we've been in a circumstance where fewer than 15% and now about 10% of seniors live in poverty, largely as a result of Social Security building that floor underneath the Social Security system. And another parallel example is the impact of collective bargaining, of bringing up wages through the collective efforts of workers in the workplace. So here again, the red line repeats the line we saw earlier of the share of income going to the richest 10%. But here we drag it out all the way to the present day. And the blue line, using the same axis, is the share of workers that belong to labor unions. So if we start in World War I, the very rich have 40% of national income, and barely 10% of workers belong to unions. In fact, even fewer belong to unions at the depth in the early 1930s. But then you pass New Deal collective bargaining law, you establish mass production unionism, the United Auto Workers, the United Steel Workers, and unionization goes from 1 in 10 workers very quickly to 1 in 3 workers. And the result, is very interesting. You get this period of what is sort of broadly characterized as shared prosperity, running from the end of World War II into the 1970s, because high rates of union membership dampen or sustain broader equality of incomes. But as unions come under attack after the 1970s and fall back to levels near where they were at the beginning of the century, so does inequality rise. Now, there are lots of other things going on here, but the relationship, I think, is very important, and it's something that the New Dealers acutely appreciated. That if you have mechanisms, if you have policies and institutions that sustain wages at the bottom, that yields shared prosperity and protection from economic crises.
Okay, we have a question here. Why would union membership drop when the gap widens? So that's because, well, Colin, why is that? Why does the gap widen when union membership drops? Can you do that for us, please? Yes. Here,
over this trajectory?
Yes, over this trajectory, or any trajectory, but on this one particularly.
Right. So beginning in the 1970s, various aspects, the United States economy goes through a sort of competitive crisis. Business profits begin to fall, and many of the institutions of the New Deal begin to be dismantled, collective bargaining among them. And so the sorts of protections that workers can claim, the economy is changing from a manufacturing to a service economy. So for all of these reasons, unions' ability to shape wages begin to fall. So when 1 in 3 workers belong to a union, they have substantial bargaining power and substantial political power. So they're sustaining not only high wages, but a high minimum wage, safety and health regulation, other things that help sustain incomes of working families. But as they lose that density, and one can read this decline in union density as a decline of all of the institutions of the New Deal. And as they begin to fall apart, so does the shared prosperity of that sort of middle years of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And we had a question about the way this graph would look today. If you extended this graph out another 5 years, would it show much difference?
No. In fact, the legend is the axis is a little bit confusing because, in fact, this does go to 2010. It's just labeled every 10 years from 1918. So this does take us through the recession and into the recovery. What we do see is a little bit more of a drop with the recession because the wealthy do lose in the recession. But in the recovery period, this line has started to inch up again. And private sector unionism is now down to the 2012 numbers is, I think, 6.2%.
Right. And we have another question here. Are the wealthier still able to prosper in the face of outsourcing while workers suffer? They would, because outsourcing reduces wages. that means that a greater portion of the wealth goes to the capital, right?
Yeah, and I mean one of the interesting things that's happening here, if we go back to our larger sort of organizing scheme of demand and the relationship between demand and wages, is American corporations and American employers are less dependent on demand from the American economy as trade becomes more important. As they can rely more and more on trading with the rest of the world and on outsourcing their wages, they're relying less and less on consumption from domestic workers.
Interesting point. Well, shall we move on then? I believe we've got one more slide.
Sure. Well, we really come back to where we started. And, you know, I think when we first had this slide up, I sort of left you with the idea that the one way to read it was to think about not picking one of these, but weighing them. And if I had to weigh them, I think, can you turn my highlighter back on, Richard?
Sorry, let me do that. I'm sorry, I thought we may find you. Apologize for that.
That's okay.
There we go. You're the presenter.
Okay.
Once again.
If I had to weigh them, you know, I think I'd start here. What the cartoonist here by bad distribution means, I think, is the distribution of incomes, that background inequality problem that is causing domestic consumption to lag behind domestic production. And so this problem, this corpulent fellow labeled overproduction, is really just a flip side of the same problem. People talked in the 1920s and 1930s about the problem of overproduction, but the real problem wasn't that the economy was producing too much, it wasn't consuming enough. No one really wanted the economy to get smaller, for it to shrink in order to match consumption. What you wanted to do was find some sort of mechanism for dealing with that consumption. And part of that was in the sort of distributional problem, but part of it, you know, was here and here and here, the sort of legacy of World War I and the trading system that it had left behind. And then, you know, I would encourage, and you know, to think about things like the stock market, the banking system, lack of confidence as shorter-term problems, as problems that do feed into that crisis of confidence, that do help tip the economy into recession. But they're not the elements that make the Great Depression great. Those are those, as I've characterized them throughout tonight's presentation, those background weaknesses. Some of the causes here, you know, Russia, prohibition, you know, look sort of trivial in retrospect. Some, as I suggested, you know, shape the timing of the Depression, but don't really cause it. But again, I think, you know, the core explanation can be teased out of this cartoon. The problem of overproduction, underconsumption, of inequality, of dysfunctional trade, and, you know, if we go to the sort of politics, Congress, and these other, that can be understood as a marker for the need for a political effort, what we'd eventually get with the New Deal, a stronger political effort to sustain wages, and by sustaining wages, sustain demand in the economy.
Now, I notice you haven't circled Congress there, and that takes us to one of our forum questions. What, if any, government action led to the Great Depression?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it was, I mean, if you're talking about sort of conventional legislative action, I think you would describe it more as a lack of government action through the 1920s. You know, it's very much a sort of laissez-faire decade. The Republican administrations of the 1920s truly believed that, you know, the economy that runs best is one that runs itself. And they're reluctant, I think, to engage in any direct legislative efforts that would tinker with that. And part of the problem as well is it's very important to recognize, and something that we haven't talked about, is until the New Deal explicitly challenged this, the Constitution really forbid the federal government from directly regulating most economic activity. That is, if it wasn't trade that went beyond American borders or economic activity that explicitly crossed state lines, the federal government was to keep its hands off. And it's the New Deal that really changes the definition of the Commerce Clause and allows the federal government to become involved in things like the regulation of wages and workplace conditions and competitive conditions. The other way I would read that or answer that question is the other sort of political response are the actions taken by financial regulators, and particularly the Federal Reserve. And there is a feeling that the Federal Reserve, which is after all a political body, did not do enough to dampen speculation on the stock market leading up to the crash in 1929, and then did not do enough to sort of step in and ensure credit and liquidity after the economy had crashed.
Okay. Any other points you want to make, Colin, before I turn this over? Before I raise this one final question from the forum. Any other points you want to make here?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, last question from the forum: did FDR's policies work, or did World War II end the Great Depression?
Well, that one's an easy one to answer. Yes. Yes to both. It certainly is true. It certainly is true that the war snapped the economy out of the Depression. And I think the way to read that is that the war really provided in a sense government spending and stimulus on a scale that the New Deal always hesitated to reach. So the war, in a sense, was a super New Deal. It was stimulus spending on an unprecedented scale. It's not correct, I think, to say that that was the only thing that ended the Depression. That in fact, the policies of the New Deal did make substantial progress, particularly between 1935 and 1937. We do see the economy begin to grow quite impressively in 36 and 37. We do begin to see employment come down. Now, then the administration gets a little bit gun-shy about the deficits it's running and scales back in 1937, and that brings another recession, the so-called Roosevelt recession of 1937. But that, I think, in some respects, just confirms the general point. The policies put in place, particularly in 1935, were working. They were leading slowly to recovery. There was a bit of a setback in 1937, and then the spending on the war really fundamentally confirmed that path, that dramatic levels of political spending are what the economy needed.
Okay, we've got more questions coming in here. Let me find that one here. Did Roosevelt hesitate to go for broke on the New Deal because of the Supreme Court? Was he afraid the Supreme Court would shoot him down?
Yeah, in part. I mean, I think it was more of a political calculation. What happened in a nutshell was that, Roosevelt loses a couple of landmark court cases in 1933 and 34 that essentially slapped down early New Deal programs. So he makes a move in 1936-37 to pack the Supreme Court. He proposes adding 5 justices to the court. So the next time one of his pieces of legislation comes around, he'll win. Now you can imagine what would happen if one of our presidents, if President Bush or President Obama tried the same thing. And that's pretty much what happened to Roosevelt in 1937. It was seen as an executive power grab, and it cost him a tremendous amount of political capital. What's also happening is Southerners in the Democratic Party, who are diehard segregationists, they come out of the Jim Crow South, are beginning to pull back from the New Deal in 1938 because they see federal programs coming into the South and having implications for civil rights, which frightens them. So Roosevelt is in a very difficult political position coming into the 1938 congressional elections. Some of the bloom is off the New Deal, and so he's sort of at a crossroads, and he engages in this period of restraint that makes things worse trying to position themselves for the 1938 midterms. That causes a lot of these problems.
Okay. And we have a question about Russia's appearance on this slide. What are they getting at here? What could Russia have possibly had to do with the Great Depression?
Oh, when in doubt, blame the communists. I'm not sure.
Of course, why not?
Yeah. I mean, Russia was, which went through its revolution in 1917, 1919, really withdrew in many respects from the world economy into its own world of troubles, was not a major contributor to the onset of the Great Depression or to really anyone's plans for recovery. So it's a curious appearance. I'm not sure if if that's meant to be an allusion to radicalism more generally, to the sort of specter of Bolshevism around the world. It's a little bit hard to interpret.
One final question. Was there a recession early in the Truman administration?
Yes. So in the sense that the war and the level of wartime spending had wiped away the troubles of the 1930s, the end to that level of commitment does cause a dip in the economy, although the dip is really dampened for a number of reasons. One of which is there's a lot of pent-up consumer demand in the economy. And so after a little dip in 1946, once we move into 47, 48, we start to move into the early years of the baby boom and a suburbanization, and people are spending money hand over fist. It's which sort of confirms that sort of consumer-driven sense of economic health. The other thing that dampens the post-World War II recession is all of the institutions installed by the New Deal. Things can only fall so far when people can draw on unemployment benefits and Social Security benefits and other sort of aspects of the welfare state. It enables them to sustain their consumption through short spells of unemployment.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we have come to the end of our seminar. We're getting some final comments, and we really got a little over, and I hope we've answered everybody's questions. Please, ladies and gentlemen, use the forum to continue the discussion and to share fresh approaches. We're going to monitor the forum until April 4th. That means we'll be responding to your questions until then. Colin, I want to thank you very much for a great seminar. I know I learned a lot, and I think the participants did as well. I know that that slide that the cartoon you began and you ended with, I have a sneaking suspicion that's going to end up in a lot of classrooms.
Yeah. I mean, you could even imagine, a group of students standing in those roles, all pointing to one another and trying to make their case.
I think we're going to see that in a number of classrooms too. Yeah, that'd be great. Line them up and have them make their case. A wonderful idea. Well, thank you very much, Colin, and I want to thank our participants. Your questions and your participation were great this evening. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please check our americainclass.org site for our upcoming seminars. We will soon be posting our fall schedule. I think you'll find some topics there you'll enjoy. Please submit your evaluations. And again, I want to thank everybody and wish you good evening.